My son told me I would make his wedding awkward. He didn't know I owned the ground he planned to get married on. I wasn't standing in some grand room when he said it. I was in my garage in Nashville, crouched beside an old oak side table that had belonged to Frank's mother. One of the legs had worked loose over the winter, the joint dried out and separating the way old things do when nobody tends to them. I had a screwdriver in one hand and a rag in the other, and the afternoon light was coming through the dusty window at that low angle that makes everything look both older and more worth keeping. Frank used to say the problem with broken furniture was never the wood. Wood wants to hold. The problem is always the person who gave up on it. I was thinking about that when my phone rang on the workbench. Nathan's name on the screen, that familiar lift in my chest, the one that never quite learned its lesson, no matter how many times it got things wrong. I picked up. He didn't say hello the way he used to, not the way he called on Sundays years ago when his voice came through warm and fast, full of whatever city he was conquering that week. He said, "Hey," in a tone I recognized, the way you recognize weather changing, not by seeing it yet, but by the way the air pressure shifts against your skin. "Mom, I need to talk to you about the wedding." I set the screwdriver down on the workbench. I didn't do it dramatically. I just set it down. He said things might get complicated. He said the guest list had gotten tight. He said it was a very formal event, not really a traditional family wedding. And then he said the word that I would carry with me for weeks afterward, like a stone in my shoe. Awkward. He said Sloan thought I might make things awkward. I looked at the table leg in my hand. The wood was sound. The joint just needed cleaning a little fresh glue time to set properly. Nothing wrong with it that patience couldn't fix. I told Nathan I understood. I told him I'd think about it. I kept my voice the way I'd kept it for 27 years of things that needed keeping even and unhurried, because falling apart in front of your child cost them something they didn't ask to carry. After I hung up, I stood in that garage for a long time with the afternoon light going orange around me. Then I went inside and washed my hands at the kitchen sink, and I looked out the back window at the yard Frank had planted, and I let myself feel the full weight of it before I put it somewhere I could manage. That was 3 weeks before the wedding. But this story doesn't start there. To understand what happened next, you need to understand what came before, not as an excuse, not as a way of asking for sympathy, but because the truth of a thing only makes sense when you see the whole shape of it. Frank Calloway died on a Tuesday in October 27 years ago. Nathan was 10 years old. Frank was working a restoration project on the east side of Nashville, helping rebuild the stone facade of an old commercial building that a preservation group had salvaged from demolition. The scaffolding gave way in the afternoon. By the time I got to the hospital, there was nothing left to wait for. Some losses come with warning. They give you time to brace yourself, to say the things that need saying, to hold someone's hand through the slow, terrible process of letting go. Frank's loss was not that kind. One morning he kissed me on the cheek and poured the last of the coffee into his thermos and drove away in his work truck, and that was the last ordinary moment of my life. Nathan was home with a neighbor when the call came. That night, after I'd gotten through the calls and the arrangements and the neighbor going home with her arms around me after the house had gone quiet in that particular way that houses go quiet when something enormous has just happened inside them, I went to Nathan's room. He was sitting up in bed with the lamp on. He'd been crying and trying to hide that he'd been crying, his lips pressed together, his eyes red. I sat on the edge of his bed and took his hand, and he looked at the ceiling for a long moment, and then he asked me if heaven had tools, because Dad liked fixing things, he said. He wanted to know if Dad would have the things he needed. I couldn't answer him. I held his hand and I said, Dad was with God now, and Nathan looked at the ceiling a little longer, and then very quietly, he asked me who was going to fix us. That question lived in me for 27 years, not as a wound exactly, more like a compass. I was 38 years old when Frank died, a school librarian at Eastover Elementary, $3,200 a month before taxes, a mortgage on a house in East Nashville that we'd stretched ourselves to afford because Frank believed the neighborhood was coming back, and Frank was usually right about things like that. One car, a 2002 Corolla that needed new tires, one child, a savings account that looked fine until you factored in what we'd been counting on Frank's income to cover. People told me I was strong. I never knew what to do with that word. Strength in those years was not noble. It was not the kind of thing you felt proud of. It was waking up before the alarm because the mortgage payment did not observe grief. It was standing in the grocery store doing math in my head, deciding which proteins we could replace with something cheaper this week. It was learning which lights you could do without and which ones your child needed in the night. I worked at the library during the week. I shelved books and read to the kindergartners on Tuesday mornings and repaired torn pages with archival tape and smiled at children whose fathers were waiting for them in the pickup line. On Saturdays, I cleaned houses in Green Hills for families who paid cash and didn't ask questions. On Sunday evenings, I baked trays of food for the church fundraisers because that was a way of giving that cost me time. Instead of money and time, I had more of, though not much. I never told Nathan how tired I was. When he needed cleats for soccer, he got cleats. When his school announced a trip to Washington, D.C., I signed the permission slip and wrote the check, and stayed up 3 nights in a row the following week, doing extra work to cover what I'd spent. When he wanted a graphing calculator for advanced math in 8th grade, I bought it and didn't let my face show what the price did to my stomach. I cut my own hair in the bathroom mirror for 4 years so I could keep his haircuts at the good barber. I hemmed my own clothes when the seams gave out. I clipped coupons, and I learned every sales cycle at every grocery store in a 5-mile radius, and I drove the extra 6 minutes to the Kroger on Dickerson when the rotisserie chickens were 2 for $1 on Wednesdays. I did this not because I was a martyr. I did it because Nathan was 10 years old and he had lost his father, and he did not need to also lose his sense that the world was solid and safe beneath him. I wanted him to walk into every room feeling like poverty had not followed him there. That was my mistake, maybe. Not the giving, the hiding of what the giving cost. Nathan was a tender boy. I want to say that clearly because what he became later makes it easy to forget. He used to leave notes in library books he knew I would return to the shelves. I would open a copy of Charlotte's Web or the Phantom Toll Booth and find a folded scrap of notebook paper in his handwriting. I love you, Mom. You make the best pancakes. When I'm rich, I'm buying you a house with a pool. On Mother's Day, when he was 12, he gave me a card. He'd made himself construction paper, folded in half letters, drawn in purple marker that were too big for the space he'd given them. You are my whole world. He'd spelled world wrong 2 O's instead of 1, and he'd carefully crossed it out and written it again. I kept that card in a tin box on my nightstand, alongside Frank's wedding ring and a small envelope containing Nathan's first lost tooth. I opened that box sometimes when the nights were hard, not to be sentimental, just to remember what was real. Nathan studied hard. He was sharp with numbers, the way Frank had been sharp with structures, an instinct for how things fit together, where the load went, what would hold. By high school, his teachers were using the word potential the way teachers do when they're trying to tell you something big without overpromising. By college, he learned to walk into a room like he expected it to rise to meet him. He studied business at the University of Tennessee. After graduation, he moved to Charlotte, North Carolina, where the real estate market was moving faster than Nashville, and a young man with drive and a good handshake could get somewhere quickly. I helped him move his furniture in my Corolla 3 trips. When I drove home to Nashville, I told myself this was what you work toward, your child building something of his own, somewhere bigger than where he started. For the first couple of years, he called every Sunday. I would sit at my kitchen table with both hands around my coffee cup and just listen to him talk. Mom, you won't believe the property I toured today. Mom, I met a broker who said, I've got a real instinct for this. Mom, when I close my first big deal, I'm taking you anywhere you want to go for dinner. He talked fast in those years the way young people talk when they can feel the future accelerating toward them. I would picture him as the boy in his soccer uniform running across the field toward me shouting, "Did you see me?" And I would whisper after we hung up that yes, I saw him. I always saw him. Then something shifted. I noticed it the way you notice the first coolness in August, not yet fall, but something changing underneath the warmth. The Sunday calls became every other Sunday. Every other Sunday became once a month. Once a month became a text that said, "Crazy busy, Mom call soon," and the call didn't come. When he visited Nashville, his posture was different. He used to drop his bag inside the door and kick his shoes off and sink into the couch, like returning to the couch was a physical relief. Now, he stood in the doorway and glanced around the house with a look I can only describe as evaluating, not unkind, just the look of someone measuring something against a standard that had developed elsewhere. He asked me once, looking up at the old ceiling fan in the kitchen, if I'd ever thought about moving somewhere newer. I told him I liked it here. I told him his father had fixed half the things in this house with his own hands. Nathan smiled, but not warmly, and said, yeah, he knew it was just very old school. Another time when I drove up to Charlotte to have lunch with him, he looked at my car in the parking garage before he hugged me. Not at me, at my car. He said my name in that careful voice and then said I was still driving this like it was a question. I said it ran fine. He lowered his voice in a way that surprised me, like the concrete pillars around us might be listening. He said it wasn't about running fine. He said clients could see. I laughed because I thought he was teasing. He was not teasing. Small corrections began arriving after that, one at a time, spaced far enough apart that each one seemed like an isolated concern rather than a pattern. If Sloane's parents asked about his father, don't go into the accident, it was too sad. if they were having dinner with her friends, maybe leave out the library stories. They wouldn't really connect to that. Don't bring homemade food to Charlotte anymore. Sloan said it made hosting feel complicated. There was that word the first time I heard it. Complicated. It would be replaced later by a sharper word, but complicated came first, and I filed it away in the same drawer where I put things I was not yet ready to look at directly. Then there was Sloan herself. The first time Nathan said her name, there was something in his voice I hadn't heard before. Not just love, though there was love in it. Something closer to relief. She's incredible, Mom, he told me. She understands the world I'm trying to build. I wanted to be glad. A mother wants her child loved. A mother wants someone who will hold her son's hand through the parts of life she can no longer reach. I turned the words over and tried to find the gladness, and I found something else underneath it, a stillness that had nothing to do with her and everything to do with the word world. He said it like the world he came from was a country he'd emigrated from, somewhere left behind on purpose. I asked what she did. Bridal lifestyle branding, he said. Social media, luxury events, brand partnerships. She knew everyone in the Charlotte wedding market. I didn't know what bridal lifestyle branding was, but I knew the sound of pride that comes from borrowed proximity. He described her the way someone describes a credential, her connections, her taste, her apartment, the people she knew. When can I meet her? I asked. He said soon. She was just busy. Busy lasted 3 months. 2 weeks after the first time he said her name, my phone rang on a Wednesday morning while I was at the community literacy program where I volunteered twice a week. I was sitting beside a woman named Iris, 71 years old, who was learning to read for the first time in her life. We were working through a short paragraph about birds, and Iris was taking each word slowly and deliberately, the way you handle something you've wanted for a long time and are afraid of breaking. I saw the name on the screen and stepped out to the hall. Victor Ashby. I almost didn't recognize it at first. Victor had worked alongside Nathan in the early years in Charlotte, one of the first people Nathan had called a real friend in that city. I hadn't heard from him in nearly 2 years. He apologized for calling out of nowhere. He said he knew it wasn't really his place, but he'd been watching something happen for a while, and he couldn't not say anything. The Nathan he knew, he told me, the one who used to talk about his mother at the office with this specific kind of pride that Nathan seemed to be going somewhere Victor didn't recognize. I stood in the hallway of the literacy center with the fluorescent light humming overhead and listened to a man I barely knew confirm what I had only been allowing myself to think in the small hours of the night. I thanked him. He said he hoped he hadn't overstepped. I said no, he hadn't. When I went back to the table, Iris looked up and asked if I was all right. I said yes, and we continued with the paragraph about birds. But something settled in me in that hallway quietly and without ceremony. I had been asking myself for months whether I was being too sensitive, reading too much into small things, failing to account for the natural distance that grows between grown children and their parents. Victor's call didn't change anything concrete, but it ended that particular question. I was not being too sensitive. I decided that afternoon not to mention Victor's call to Nathan. Not out of strategy, not yet. I just went still and started watching more carefully. It was the same instinct that had gotten me through the years after Frank died. Sometimes you cannot act on what you know. You can only keep your eyes open and your papers in order and wait to understand the shape of the thing you're dealing with. The shape became clearer the evening Nathan finally brought Sloan to my house in Nashville. I cooked too much, which was the only way I knew how to cook for occasions that mattered. Roasted chicken, green beans, a lemon tart, because Nathan had asked for lemon tart every year on his birthday from age 8 through 18. I got out the blue flower plates I kept for good occasions. I polished the silverware. I put fresh flowers in a glass vase on the table. I wore my navy dress, the one I'd worn to Nathan's college graduation, taken in at the waist twice now, one button replaced last spring when the original went dull. I put on lipstick twice because my hands were nervous the first time. Before they arrived, I walked through the house adjusting things that didn't need adjusting. A pillow on the couch, the angle of the flowers. I wanted Sloan to feel welcomed here. I wanted Nathan to look at his home and feel something other than what I'd been sensing him feel lately when he stood in the doorway and looked around. What I really wanted, though, I didn't say it to myself in those exact words until much later, was for my grown son to look at me and still see someone worth being proud of. The headlights swept across the front window just after 7. I opened the door before they reached the porch. Nathan came up the walk first, handsome in a jacket I hadn't seen before, smiling with half his face. Behind him came Sloan Whitfield. She was exactly what I had assembled from the pieces Nathan had given me. Blonde hair falling over one shoulder, a cream-colored dress that looked too delicate for my front porch steps, heels that cost more than my car payment. She was beautiful in a very specific and deliberate way, the kind of beauty that is also a form of communication. She looked at my house before she looked at me. Just a second, maybe less. A quick scan across the porch and the flower pots and the older sedan in the driveway and the modest brick front. Then she turned her eyes to me and smiled. "Mrs. Calloway," she said, and offered her hand. "I've heard so much about you." Her voice was warm and polished and entirely controlled. I took her hand and felt the first chill of what was coming, not because of anything I could have named, but because Nathan, standing just behind her right shoulder, did not say, "Call her mom." He did not say, "This is the woman who raised me." He stood there and watched her reaction to my house with a look that I can only describe as holding his breath. Inside, Sloan moved through the living room with the careful attention of someone conducting a quiet assessment. She stopped at the family photos on the wall, the ones I'd had there for 20 years, and said, "Oh, this is charming. Very personal." There was a pause before personal, just long enough to feel the blade inside it. Nathan took her coat like she was made of something fragile. My son, who used to throw his backpack across this kitchen floor and drink milk straight from the carton, now moved around Sloan as though every gesture was being evaluated. She sat down at my table, and when I brought out the chicken and the green beans, she thanked me beautifully and said I really didn't have to go to all that trouble. I said it was no trouble. I loved cooking for family. Her smile changed slightly. Family. The word seemed to land between us like something she had not approved yet. She ate a small portion and called the food very authentic. My son's face relaxed visibly, as though I had passed a test. She pulled out her phone to photograph the table, shifted the vase 3 inches to the left, and said the lighting was a little warm, but she could fix it. Nathan laughed softly and said she was always working. When I brought out the lemon tart, Nathan saw it and something moved across his face, something real, unguarded. He said "Mom" in a quiet voice, and for a second, I could see the boy who had asked for this cake every single birthday. Then Sloan touched his wrist lightly. She reminded him they had the venue tasting next week and that he'd said he wanted to be more careful. His hand stopped above the plate. "Right," he said. He pulled back. That was the first time I watched my son deny himself a memory because someone beside him had decided it didn't fit the occasion. Sloan took one small bite and said the tart was very nostalgic. Later in the living room, she asked about my work. I told her I'd been a school librarian for nearly 30 years at Eastover Elementary. She said how precious and tilted her head in a way that managed to be both sympathetic and dismissive, the way you might respond to someone telling you they collected ceramic owls. She asked if I'd been to many formal events. When I said a few through church and school over the years, she nodded and mentioned that she and Nathan would have a very elevated guest list. His business contacts, her brand partners, people who ran in a certain world, and that it could feel a little overwhelming for someone who wasn't used to that environment. Nathan finally spoke. He said, "Sloan, Mom's fine. Fine. Not wonderful. Not my mother belongs there more than anyone. Just fine, as though fine were a category that covered all bases and required no further thought." I said lightly that I thought I could manage a salad fork. Sloan laughed, not because she found it funny, and said, of course, she only meant that weddings revealed so much about people who fit naturally, who felt out of place, who drew attention without meaning to. The drive back home was 3 hours. I didn't do them all at once that night. I got about 40 minutes south of Charlotte, pulled into a truck stop, and sat in the parking lot for a while with the engine running and the radio off. Then I drove the rest of the way home and went to bed and did not let myself think about any of it until morning. The engagement dinner was 6 weeks later. By then, I had met Sloan twice more, both times, in Charlotte, once at a rooftop brunch where everyone wore beige and cream and gold, and she introduced me to her friends as Nathan's mom, Dot. She lives in Nashville. She used to be a librarian, and once at an engagement party her parents hosted in a private room at a restaurant downtown. Her father, Garrett, shook my hand and said it was good to finally meet Nathan's mother, and that sentence did more for me than Garrett could have known. The glass room was on the 22nd floor of a hotel in downtown Charlotte, all windows and chrome and white orchids, the city spread out behind the glass like a glittering proof of concept. In my purse, wrapped in a handkerchief, was a small velvet box. Inside the box was a pearl brooch that had belonged to Frank's mother, Eleanor Calloway. Eleanor had worn it on her wedding day in 1952, pinned to the lace collar of the dress she had sewn herself. Frank's sister had worn it at her wedding. I had worn it on the day I married Frank in the small Catholic church on Gallatin Avenue, with white carnations and folding chairs and a reception in the parish hall where Frank's uncle played guitar. The brooch was not expensive by anyone's current standards, but it carried the weight of women who had loved through hard years and kept going anyway. I had brought it because I still believed, despite everything I had been watching accumulate, that I could welcome Sloan Whitfield into this family. That was what mothers did. Even when their hearts were uncertain, they set the table. I didn't find out about the engagement from my son. I found out because Sloan lifted her left hand toward the candlelight at the table and waited for me to notice the ring. Nathan's smile was nervous. Sloan said they wanted to tell me in person because it felt more meaningful that way. Meaningful. I looked at the ring and then at my son and said, "You're engaged." He said yes. I stood and hugged him, and for 1 second he held me the way he used to, with his full weight, like he remembered the shape of my arms around him. Then Sloan shifted beside us and he let go. I turned to Sloan and said, "Congratulations." She offered me her cheek. Garrett stood and shook my hand again. Patricia smiled from across the table. We sat down and the evening moved forward the way formal evenings move conversation and wine and courses I couldn't always name. Halfway through the appetizers, Sloan lifted her champagne glass and said they had a date and a venue. The venue had one opening, she said, and it felt like fate. She said the name with the pleasure of someone producing the winning card. Magnolia Ridge Estate. The name hit the inside of my chest like a stone thrown against a window, not breaking through, just the impact of it. I put my hand around my water glass. Magnolia Ridge. I had not heard that name spoken at a dinner table in years. I had read it on legal documents and quarterly reports and signed my name on papers connected to its renovation and staffing and expansion for over 2 decades. But hearing Sloan say it like a trophy, like something she had discovered and claimed for herself, brought the past rushing up so fast that I had to concentrate on my breathing. I said that was beautiful. Magnolia Ridge is beautiful. Sloan beamed and said it was beyond beautiful. Exclusive. Historic but not dusty. Elegant without being cold. Very Tennessee luxury without looking like a ranch theme party. Later, when the waiter cleared the plates, I reached into my purse and placed the velvet box on the table. I slid it towards Sloan. I told her it had belonged to Frank's mother, that Frank's mother had worn it on her wedding day, and that I had worn it on mine. I said if she wanted, she could tuck it inside her bouquet, somewhere no one else would see it, just as a blessing, one family passing something to another. Nobody spoke for a moment. Garrett leaned forward slightly. Patricia's face went soft. Sloan opened the box. She looked at the brooch the way you look at a found button. She said that was so sweet. Then she said it didn't really match the aesthetic. She closed the box with delicate fingers and pushed it back toward me. Not far, just enough. Nathan reached for his wine glass and said nothing. I put the box in my purse. I kept my face where I needed it, and something inside me, something I had been holding carefully for a very long time, folded very quietly shut. On the way to the elevator, Nathan walked with me, while Sloan spoke with her mother about floral arrangements. I said Magnolia Ridge was a big choice. He said Sloan loved it. I asked what he thought. He said he wanted her to have what she wanted. I said that could be a beautiful thing as long as what she wanted still left room for who he was. He said, "Mom, please don't analyze everything." The elevator doors opened and I stepped in. As they closed, I saw him turn back toward the restaurant, toward Sloan, toward the glittering life that had promised to make him into someone no one could pity. I rode down alone with Eleanor's brooch in my purse and the name Magnolia Ridge burning in my memory like a lamp left on in an empty room. The months after the engagement dinner arrived, the way slow damage always does, not in a single blow, but in accumulation, each small thing unremarkable on its own, the pattern only visible when you stepped back far enough to see the whole. Nathan began editing me before I had the chance to make a mistake. Not cruelly. That is the part that is hardest to explain to someone who has not experienced it. The corrections came with reasonable voices and plausible justifications. If Sloane's parents brought up anything about his childhood, keep it light. The heavy stuff made the room uncomfortable. If they were at dinner with her brand partners, maybe skip the library years, those people moved in a different world. Don't bring food when you visit Charlotte anymore. Sloane felt it implied she wasn't providing enough. He started using phrases that did not belong to him. Optics, emotional tone, protecting our peace. That last one landed hardest. One evening I called at 9 o'clock. Nothing urgent, just his voice, and he sent back a text that said, "Can this wait? Sloane and I are protecting our peace tonight." I set the phone down on the kitchen counter and stood there for a moment, protecting their peace from me, from a phone call from his mother at 9 in the evening. I did not call back. I want to be honest about what I did instead of calling back. I went to the cabinet where I kept Frank's old toolbox, the one I'd never been able to move to the garage because it still smelled faintly of whatever he'd been working on the last time he used it, and I took out a small wrench, and I finished fixing the side table from the garage. I tightened the leg joint until it held. Then I put the toolbox back exactly where it lived, and I went to bed, and I did not let myself think about the phone for the rest of the night. That was how I handled things, not by performing strength, just by putting one foot in front of the other until morning came and the day gave me something practical to do. But the accumulation continued. The second time I met Sloane's friends was at a rooftop brunch in Charlotte that Sloane had organized to celebrate the engagement officially, the kind of gathering where every surface looked like it had been selected, the flowers and the tablecloths and the exact shade of everyone's clothing, beige and cream and soft gold. I wore my navy dress again because it was the nicest thing I own. Sloane introduced me to the table as Nathan's mom, Dot. She lives in Nashville. She used to be a librarian. Used to be, as though the 30 years I had spent helping children find language staying late for the ones whose parents worked double shifts, remembering which kid needed patience and which one needed boundaries, as though all of that had concluded and left nothing behind worth mentioning. One of Sloane's friends smiled and asked if I read a lot of romance novels now. Before I could answer, Sloane laughed and said I was more sentimental than romantic. Nathan sipped his coffee and looked out over the city. He did not correct her. He did not say anything at all. I have thought about that moment many times since, not with bitterness, or not only with bitterness, with the specific grief of watching someone you raised choose repeatedly and deliberately to look away. 3 weeks after the rooftop brunch, Nathan called and said he wanted to take me to dinner, just the two of us. His voice had that particular quality I had learned to recognize, bright on the surface and constructed underneath, the way a house looks fine from the street when the foundation has already started to shift. I said, of course, and I drove up to Charlotte on a Sunday afternoon, and we went to a quiet Italian place he liked, and over pasta, he told me about the wedding timeline and the vendor bookings and how much work Sloane was putting into every detail. He said it with admiration. I listened and asked questions and told him I was glad he was happy. Then he set down his fork. He said there was something he needed to talk to me about. He needed me to not get upset. There it is, the sentence that people use when they have already decided to cause harm and would prefer you to receive it quietly. I put my hands flat on the table. He said the wedding was getting complicated. The guest list had gotten tight. It was going to be a very formal event. Cameras, business contacts, brand, partners. Not really a traditional family gathering. He said Sloane was worried about the energy. He said she thought I might make things awkward. Awkward. I had heard the word before that evening at my house in Nashville when she'd asked about formal events, and Nathan had said, "Mom's fine." But this was different. This was the word delivered as a verdict. This was my son looking at his hands on the tablecloth and telling me that the woman he was going to marry had decided I was a social liability at my own son's wedding. I asked him what he meant by awkward. He said I sometimes got emotional. He said Sloane wanted to keep the day calm. He said there would be a lot of people there who didn't know our history, and she didn't want anything heavy coming up. Our history. I turned those two words over in my mind. Our history. He meant Frank's death. He meant the years I worked double and cut my own hair and glued his shoes back together. He meant every prayer I had said over his sleeping head when I thought he couldn't hear me. He had gathered all of that into the phrase, our history, and was now telling me that Sloane Whitfield found it inconvenient. I asked him what exactly he was asking me to do. He said he thought it might be better if I celebrated from home. The restaurant continued around us, silverware and conversation, and a man at the bar watching a game on the television. All of it ordinary and indifferent. I said, "You want your mother to watch your wedding on a screen." He said it wasn't like that. He said they would have a professional live stream, good cameras, good sound. He said I would be able to see everything. I thought about the front pew, the one I had been picturing for years, since Nathan was small enough to fall asleep on my shoulder during Sunday services, the one where I had imagined sitting with Frank's photograph in my purse and watching our son make his promises. I had not known I was carrying that image until this moment when it was being taken away. I asked him if Sloane's father knew, if Garrett Whitfield knew that the groom's mother had been removed from the guest list. Nathan hesitated. He said they hadn't framed it that way. I asked how they had framed it. He said they had told people I preferred something quieter. The numbness started there, spreading outward from somewhere behind my sternum. He had told people I chose this. He had offered my name to the lie without asking me. I said, "Nathan, I have tried to be kind to Sloane. I welcomed her into my home. I gave her your grandmother's brooch. I have stayed quiet when she made me feel small because I didn't want to put you in the middle." He said that was the problem. He said I thought everything was an attack. I said no. I said I understood exactly what was happening. I said I understood he had allowed someone to convince him that his mother was a problem to manage. His breathing changed. For a moment I thought the boy underneath the man might surface, the one who had asked who was going to fix us. I waited. He said, "Please don't make this harder than it already is." That sentence finished something in me. Not my love. A mother's love does not die that cleanly or that quickly, but my willingness to keep absorbing the blow on behalf of everyone else's comfort. That ended. I told him I hoped the day gave him exactly what he had chosen. I said good night. I drove home 3 hours through the dark with the radio off, and when I got inside, I sat at the kitchen table for a long time. Then I cried properly the way I hadn't allowed myself in years, not neatly and not quietly, and when it was over, I washed my face and I looked at the tin box on the counter and thought about what came next. The next morning I woke before sunrise. I made coffee. I dressed carefully in black slacks and a white blouse and the beige cardigan I saved for situations that required me to be taken seriously. I pulled my hair back and put on lipstick and tucked a card into my purse. Not a credit card. The key card for a safe deposit box at First Tennessee Bank that I had not opened in nearly 4 years. The bank opened at 9. I was there at 9:05. The manager, a man named Ellis, whose hair had gone fully white since I'd last seen him, recognized me from the old days. He didn't ask questions. Good bankers know when silence is a service. He inserted his key and I inserted mine, and together we opened the long metal box, and he carried it to the private room and closed the door behind him. I sat alone with it for a moment before I opened it. Inside were folders arranged in Frank's handwriting, the square, careful letters he used when something needed to last. Insurance, property, and at the back a folder labeled Callaway Legacy Holdings, and beneath that Magnolia Ridge Estate. Now I will tell you what I had never told my son. Frank didn't only swing a hammer at Magnolia Ridge. He saw something there that no one else was seeing at the time. In the mid-90s, the estate was a wreck, a tired limestone property in the Tennessee Hill Country with cracked terraces and rusted gates and a ballroom that smelled of rainwater and 20 years of neglect. The original family had run out of money and will. A small group of investors were trying to organize a restoration effort, mostly local businessmen with more sentiment than capital. Frank came home one evening with dust on his boots and light in his eyes. He spread a set of photographs across the kitchen table. He said the bones of that place were extraordinary. He said people had given up on it too soon. We did not have money to invest. We had a mortgage and a young son, and Frank's truck needed a new transmission. But Frank had received a bonus from a large commercial restoration project downtown more than we'd expected, and he wanted to put part of it into Magnolia Ridge. I was afraid. He was certain. He said some things were worth believing in before the world agreed with you. When he died, I was advised by everyone with an opinion to sell, liquidate whatever interests he had, take the cash, stabilize the household. And maybe that was the practical thing, but grief does strange things to the arithmetic of practicality. I could not sell something Frank had staked a piece of himself on. It felt like selling his certainty along with the shares. So I held on. Then I bought more, not all at once, and not with money I had. Over the years, as the estate found its footing and began attracting attention, the original investors aged and moved and divorced and needed liquidity. I bought a share from a partner who was going through a divorce, another from a man who relocated to Arizona, a third when the estate needed emergency capital after a severe storm and one of the original investors wanted out. I had a good attorney. I had patience. I had years of living simply while people assumed simple meant helpless. Callaway Legacy Holdings became the majority owner of Magnolia Ridge Estate over a period of nearly 15 years. My company, my name on the documents, though, placed carefully behind the professional management structure Meg Harlow had advised. I had never told Nathan. When he was young, he was too young. Later, I told myself I was waiting for the right moment, protecting him from becoming entitled, giving him room to build something he could genuinely call his own. Later still, as he grew more image conscious and more uncomfortable with where he'd come from, I told myself there would be time. There is a particular kind of silence that feels like wisdom right up until it becomes a room where misunderstandings grow in the dark. I had been living in that room for years without admitting it. There was one more folder. This one had Nathan's name on the tab. 6 years ago, Nathan's real estate career had nearly collapsed before it truly got started. He had invested in a development deal with men who were better at projecting confidence than delivering results. The project failed. The money dissolved. Nathan was left holding obligations he couldn't meet, and there were whispers in the Charlotte market about complaints that might threaten his license. He called me during those months. He didn't ask for help. He said he was fine. In that particular way, that means the opposite. The compressed voice and the too quick answers and the long pauses that were doing all the actual communicating. I made calls, quiet ones. Meg Harlow helped me structure everything through a holding entity so that no transaction could be traced back to me personally. The money arrived to Nathan through what appeared to be a private investment group that had taken an interest in his long-term potential. That phrase was mine. I wrote it in a note that Meg passed through the proper channels. I did not want him humiliated. I did not want him to look at me with the specific pain of a son who has been rescued by his mother. I wanted him to believe the world had recognized something in him and chosen him on his own merits. Maybe that was the kindness that poisoned everything downstream. I sat in that private room for a long time with Frank's folders open in front of me. The morning light came through a small window near the ceiling. I thought about the woman being offered a live stream link. I thought about the man my son had become and the choices that had made him. Then I placed selected copies into a leather portfolio Meg had given me years ago, returned the rest to the box, and called Meg from the parking lot. She answered on the third ring. Meg Harlow was in her early 70s, the kind of woman who had stopped apologizing for her intelligence sometime in her 40s and never looked back. She had been Frank's attorney first, then mine. She knew where every signature was buried, which doors could be opened, and which ones should stay shut. Her office was on the second floor of a renovated brick building near downtown Nashville, above a bakery that always smelled of cinnamon, and she had hung a black and white photograph of Nashville in the 1950s on the wall behind her desk because she liked things that had outlasted the expectations placed on them. When I finished telling her about the phone call, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said someone had mistaken grace for weakness. I told her that sounded like something Frank used to say. She said it was something Frank used to say more than once. I placed the leather portfolio on her desk. She reviewed the documents without hurrying. The event contract for Magnolia Ridge included a standard conduct clause. Clients were required to treat staff vendors' ownership and property with respect. Misrepresentation of guest information, abusive conduct towards staff, or actions likely to create disruption could trigger review, suspension, or termination of the event agreement. I asked what our options were. Meg said I could appear at Magnolia Ridge in an official capacity if there was legitimate reason, and that management could introduce me as an ownership representative without immediately disclosing the full structure. I sat with that for a moment. She said the final venue walkthrough was typically attended by management and sometimes ownership when a high-profile event was involved. She said she had already pulled the current event contract when I'd called from the bank. I told her I was not trying to stop a wedding. I told her I was trying to stop a lie. She looked at me for a long moment. Then she said that was a much stronger position. 2 days later, something happened that I had not anticipated. I received a phone call from a number I didn't recognize on a Tuesday morning while I was watering the herbs on my back porch. I almost let it go to voicemail. Something made me answer. A man's voice, controlled, formal, with a particular heaviness underneath the formality that I recognized as the sound of a person carrying something they hadn't finished deciding what to do with. "Mrs. Calloway, this is Garrett Whitfield." I stood very still. Water ran over the edge of the basil pot and darkened the concrete. He said he was not calling about legal matters. He said he was calling because he had received some documents from my attorney and because he had been operating under the impression that I would be attending the rehearsal dinner, and he had recently come to understand that his impression might have been wrong. I said that was correct. He said he had been told I preferred not to attend due to personal discomfort. I told him my son had told me that Sloan believed my presence would make the wedding awkward. There was a silence on the line. When Garrett spoke again, his voice was lower. He said he owed me an apology. He said his family name was attached to this event, and if I had been disrespected under that name, he owed me the basic decency of saying he had not known. Those words reached something in me I hadn't known was still waiting to be reached. Not forgiveness, not yet, and not relief. Something simpler. The recognition of a person who still understood the difference between what was convenient and what was right. He invited me to the rehearsal dinner. He said if I chose to come, I would be received properly. Properly. Such a plain word. After weeks of elevated and curated and on brand, the word properly nearly made me laugh and nearly made me cry at the same time. I told him I would think about it. Before he hung up, he said he had 3 daughters and that Sloan was his youngest and that he had loved her fiercely and probably too easily. He said if she had done what the documents suggested, she needed to face it before she became someone's wife. After the call, I sat down on the back porch steps. The basil was dripping. The morning was already warm and going warmer. I sat there long enough for the concrete to dry around my feet. Then I called Meg. She answered with, "I wondered when he would call." I asked if she had expected it. She said she had hoped for it. She said the way Garrett had communicated through his attorneys had been too direct and too specific for a man who was protecting a lie. Men who protect lies, she said, use fog. Garrett had asked for documents. I told her he had invited me to the rehearsal dinner. She said good. I said walking in there could look like I was starting something. She said not if I had been invited by the host. I asked if she would come with me. She said she was hoping I'd ask, but there was something else. Something that arrived 2 days after Garrett's call through Carol Finch, who had been my closest friend for 30 years and who only called in the middle of a weekday when something needed saying. She asked if I was sitting down. Her niece Jenna was 24 years old and had been doing part-time work for an administrative team that supported the wedding planning group Nathan and Sloan had hired. Not the lead planner, a woman named Dana Pryor, but a secondary team that handled logistics, seating charts, vendor communications. Jenna processed spreadsheets. She wasn't supposed to be looking at the notes attached to the guest records. She looked anyway, the way you look when something doesn't feel right, and she took photographs of what she found before she fully understood why. The notes described me as having declined attendance due to discomfort with the couple's lifestyle and irreconcilable differences with the bride. Carol read that sentence to me twice. Declined, discomfort, irreconcilable differences. I had not declined. I had been told to stay home, but the record said I had made a choice. The record said I had looked at my son's wedding and decided I didn't want to be there. There was more. Sloan had told the planning team I was emotionally unpredictable, that I might try to make the event about my late husband, that I had difficulty accepting Nathan's life as it was now, and in a separate communication that Jenna had also photographed, Sloan had told at least some of the invited guests that I had refused to attend because I didn't support the marriage and that Nathan was heartbroken but trying to respect my boundaries. My boundaries. She had taken my exclusion and dressed it in language that made it look like my own choice, my own limitation, my own failure to accept my son's happiness. I stood up from the kitchen chair when Carol finished reading. Then I sat back down because my legs felt unsteady in a way they rarely did. Carol said Jenna was scared. She didn't want to lose work or get into legal trouble, but she had felt sick about what she'd seen, and when Garrett Whitfield had asked one of the other assistants whether there was a seating arrangement for the groom's mother, and Sloan had come in and said it was handled, Jenna had understood that someone was going to get hurt by what she knew and hadn't said. I asked if Jenna would speak with Meg. Carol said she would ask. The answer came back within the hour. Jenna would share what she had if her identity could be protected as much as possible. She would not make public accusations, but she had photographs, and the photographs showed a specific email in which Sloan had approved the wording of the guest record notation. The email also contained a line that I read 3 times before it stopped feeling like something I must be misreading. The groom prefers not to challenge the bride's decision due to family emotional complications. Nathan's silence had been documented. Whatever he had told himself about staying out of it, about keeping peace, about not wanting to be in the middle, it had been recorded in writing and approved by his future wife as part of the architecture of my removal. I forwarded everything to Meg. Then I picked up the velvet box from the kitchen counter, the one with Eleanor's brooch still inside, and I opened it under the kitchen light. The pearls caught the late afternoon sun coming through the window. They had been worn by women who had survived things and kept loving anyway. I closed the box without taking anything out. That night I texted Nathan, not about any of it, just a short message that said I hoped he was well and that I would be in touch. He replied with a thumbs up and nothing more. I sat at the kitchen table with the leather portfolio in front of me and the late Tennessee sky going purple through the window, and I thought about Sloan's careful language and Nathan's careful silence and the empty chair that someone had decided needed a lie to explain it. I was not going to let her write my absence as my choice. The next morning, Meg called to tell me she had arranged for me to attend the final walkthrough at Magnolia Ridge the following Thursday. She said Renee Ashford, the estate's general manager, was fully briefed and would introduce me appropriately. She said I should arrive as myself, not as a grieving mother, not as someone seeking confrontation, as the ownership representative of Callaway Legacy Holdings, ensuring contractual compliance before a high-profile private event. I asked her if she thought it would change anything. She said she thought it would give everyone the opportunity to make their own choices visible. I told her that sounded like something Frank would say too. She said Frank had been a man worth listening to. I hung up and looked at my reflection in the dark kitchen window. 67 years old, gray through my hair, lines around my mouth that weren't there 10 years ago, brown eyes that had cried too much and somehow kept looking forward anyway. In 2 days, I would drive to Magnolia Ridge, not as a guest, not as the woman on the live stream, as the person they had never thought to look for. The drive to Magnolia Ridge on Thursday morning felt nothing like the drives I had made there in the years before. Those had been functional trips, quarterly visits to review renovation progress or walk the property with Renee before a major season. I had always parked near the administrative cottage and gone straight to the office and left the same afternoon. I had never stood in the oak grove at sunset. I had never walked the ceremony space. I had treated the estate the way I treated most of the things I owned, quietly at a distance, as a responsibility rather than a presence. This morning was different. I left Nashville before sunrise and drove the first hour in the dark, the highway empty and the headlights cutting through the low October fog that settles over the hill country before the sun burns it off. I had the leather portfolio on the passenger seat and a thermos of coffee and the radio off. I wanted to think clearly, and I found that music, even music I liked, filled the space where thinking needed to happen. By the time I reached the Tennessee hill country, the sky had gone from black to a deep charcoal gray, and the limestone outcroppings along the roadside were just becoming visible, pale and ancient against the dark cedar. I had driven this road dozens of times over 2 decades, and I had never once let myself simply look at it. I let myself look at it now. When the gates of Magnolia Ridge appeared ahead of me, I pulled the car to a stop before the entrance and sat for a moment with the engine running. The bronze sign above the gates caught the first weak light of morning. Beyond the gates, the oak canopy over the driveway was so thick it held its own darkness, a long corridor of old growth that the estate's original builders had understood was worth more than anything they could plant deliberately. Frank had stood somewhere in that corridor 28 years ago with dust on his work boots pointing at the angles of morning light coming through the branches and saying that some places earn their history, whether people showed up to acknowledge it or not. I drove through the gates. Renee Ashford was already outside the administrative cottage when I arrived, her breath visible in the cool air, holding 2 cups of coffee. She handed me one without being asked. That simple gesture, the assumption that I would need something warm before walking into what we were about to walk into, told me more about her character than a year of quarterly calls had. She said they had arrived 40 minutes ago. Nathan and Sloan, the lead florist, the catering coordinator, 2 vendor representatives, and Dana Pryor, who had apparently spent the drive from Charlotte in a state of visible tension. Renee said it with the neutrality of a person who has learned that professional discretion is its own form of integrity. I asked if she was ready. She said she had been ready since Meg Harlow's documents arrived 2 days ago. We entered through the side corridor as planned, and the sound of Sloane's voice reached us before we reached the ballroom. She was telling someone that the floral sample on the center table created a sightline problem and that she needed the entire arrangement reconsidered before 11. Her voice carried the particular quality of someone who had not been contradicted enough in the past to understand that contradiction was survivable. I stepped into the ballroom. The room was everything I had approved on paper and more. The pale oak floor, the restored ceiling beams, the tall windows filling the east wall with the specific amber of an October morning. I had signed the renovation budget for that floor repair 8 years ago at my kitchen table. I had never stood on it before today. Nathan saw me first. I watched his face the way I had watched his face his whole life for the truth of what was happening inside him before his expressions caught up. What I saw in those first seconds was not anger and not relief. It was the look of a man who has been dreading a moment and has finally arrived at it and understands that the dread was worse than the moment itself will be. Sloane turned a beat later. The composure she installed in the following half-second was impressive, and also in the way of all things constructed under pressure, slightly off. The smile arrived correctly, but the eyes were doing something different. She said my name and asked what I was doing there. Renee stepped beside me and introduced me as the ownership representative attending the final compliance review on behalf of Callaway Legacy Holdings. She said it as a matter of operational fact, the way a pilot announces the altitude with no particular emphasis and no invitation for debate. The silence that followed had weight and direction. Dana Pryor looked up from her planning binder. The florist Michael set down the stems he was holding. 2 members of the estate staff near the side door found reasons to examine the wall behind them. Sloane said this was Nathan's mother. Renee said, "Yes, we are aware." That exchange, 5 words and 4 words, rearranged the architecture of the room more completely than anything that had been said yet that morning. Sloane had offered a category, a label she had spent months using to define and limit me. Renee had received it and simply confirmed it as one true thing among several, none of which were disqualifying. Nathan took a step toward me and said we should talk. I told him in a moment. Something moved through his face and settled. The walkthrough resumed. Renee covered the ceremony timing and the vendor load schedule and the preservation requirements for the Grove. She covered photography access and the catering service corridor and the sound equipment restrictions near the stone chapel wall. She was thorough and unhurried, and Sloane absorbed most of it with the performance of a person who has been trained to present patience as confidence. When Renee reached the drone restrictions, the performance developed a fault line. The insurance terms and structural protection requirements prohibited drone operation below a specified altitude near the historic roofline. Sloane said that ruined the aerial footage they had planned. Renee explained that the terms had been agreed to in the signed contract. Sloane said something about how nobody actually read through all of that language, and I wrote it down. She noticed me writing. She asked what I was recording. I said compliance observations. She stepped toward me with her voice dropped to a register she may have believed was private. She told me she didn't know what arrangement I had with the staff, but that I needed to understand this was not the appropriate moment for whatever point I was making. Nathan said her name. She raised one finger in his direction without looking at him, and he stopped speaking. I had watched that gesture before from a distance at restaurants and in photographs. Seeing it in person in the room where I was standing produced a clarity I had not fully possessed until that moment. That was the mechanism. That one raised finger was the entire explanation for 2 years of my son becoming someone I did not recognize. Renee continued through the remaining items on the walkthrough checklist. Sloane held herself together through the preservation rules for the Oak Grove and through the catering restriction specifications. She was visibly working at it by the time Renee reached the media access protocols. Then Renee mentioned that all final clearances, including expanded media credentials for the regional bridal publication that Sloane had requested access for, required ownership sign-off before the event date. Sloane said that had been agreed to already. Renee said it was subject to final review as specified in the amendment addendum, which had been attached to the contract 3 weeks prior. Sloane said no one had flagged that as an issue before now. Renee said it had been in the documents. The silence after that was different from the previous silences. This one had an edge. Sloane looked at me, and the composure that had been holding since I entered the room finally made a decision to stop trying. She said I had been told that this event would be difficult for me. She said it plainly, the way you say something you have been thinking privately for a long time and have finally decided there is no longer any reason to dress up. The room stopped. Dana looked up from her binder. Renee went still with the particular stillness of a professional who is tracking everything. Nathan's face lost color in a way I had seen only twice before in his life. I said I had been told my presence would make the wedding awkward. The word landed in the restored ballroom and did not leave. Sloane said the wedding had a specific tone and that emotional disruption was not something they had budgeted for. She said it with the vocabulary of event management tone and experience and elevated atmosphere, as though my exclusion from my son's wedding had been a production decision rather than a cruelty. I said emotional disruption. She said yes. She said some people belonged in certain spaces naturally and some people created tension without meaning to, and that protecting the event was not the same as being unkind to anyone. Nathan looked at the floor. I looked at the corner of the ballroom ceiling where the small fixed camera sat in its bracket, steady and impersonal. Sloane followed my eyes. I watched the certainty she had been wearing since she arrived change into something that had not been there before. Renee said, without any particular emphasis, that all common areas of the estate were recorded for insurance purposes as specified in Section 4 of the signed contract. Sloane said you cannot use that. Renee said the footage belonged to the estate. Dana said quietly that perhaps they should pause and bring the legal representatives into the conversation. Sloane turned to her and said she was not paying Dana to suggest pauses. The words were sharp and public, and everyone in the room heard the way they landed on Dana, who had already been carrying too much for too long. Renee made a note. Sloane saw it. What happened next, I believe, was the result of all the weeks of careful management reaching a limit. They were never designed to hold past a certain pressure. She turned to me and said she knew exactly what this was. She said it was the thing she had been working to prevent since the beginning. She said I had found a way to insert myself because I could not accept that Nathan had built a life that moved past me. Then she said struggling through something did not make a person appropriate for every occasion. She said it did not give someone the right to bring that weight into a day that had been carefully constructed. She pointed at me. She said I should have known my place. The ballroom was absolutely quiet. I felt very calm. Not the numbness that comes from pain exceeding its capacity. A different thing. The calm of a person who has been trying to name something for a long time and has just heard it name itself. I said my place had been beside my son when he made one of the most important promises of his life. I turned to Renee and asked her to place the Whitfield Callaway event under formal compliance evaluation to freeze all pending approvals and clearances pending legal review and to notify Meg Harlow. Renee said, "Yes, Mrs. Callaway." I walked toward the door. Nathan said, "Mom," once, in a voice that had traveled a long way to reach me. I stopped walking but did not turn around. I told him to read the contract. Then I went out into the morning. He found me at the oak tree near the fountain path where I had stopped because I needed a breath before I looked at him, and because the oak was large and old and had survived things, and that seemed like a reasonable place to stand. He said I had embarrassed him. I turned and looked at him and waited for him to hear himself. He heard himself. His mouth closed. I said I had not acted. I had simply shown up as what I was. He said that was the same thing, and I said, "Nathan, it is not." I said there was a difference between performance and presence, and he had spent 2 years confusing them because Sloan had taught him that everything was a performance and he had been a willing student. Sloan came through the ballroom doors behind him with Donna at a cautious distance. She said we needed to resolve whatever this was. I said there was nothing to resolve. She stepped closer and said that respect would have been accepting their decision about the guest list rather than manufacturing a reason to be present. I said their decision had been to remove the groom's mother from his wedding. She said I didn't fit the event. She said it with her chin level and her voice controlled. She said not everyone belonged in every setting, and that some people were better suited to quiet private occasions, and that their wedding was public and important to their professional and personal future. Their future. I looked at Nathan. He was looking at Sloan. I asked him if he had heard her. He said she was under a lot of pressure. I said no. I said she was being honest. I said I was glad she had been honest inside as well. I told Renee, who had followed us into the courtyard, to include the exterior footage in the compliance review. Renee said the courtyard path and fountain area were both covered. Something shifted in Sloan's face. It was not guilt. It was the specific fear of a person whose entire strategy has depended on controlling what is visible and who has just understood that something visible has escaped control. Nathan said, "Mom, wait. Let's talk before anything gets filed." I told him I loved him. I said I was not going to disappear to make his life look cleaner. I walked to my car. The young parking attendant held the door with a formality that cost him nothing and gave me something I did not expect to need as much as I did. I sat behind the wheel until my hands were ready. I did not look in the rearview mirror. Nathan came to my house that night. I heard him park, and I sat at the kitchen table and waited. He knocked, which he had not done since he was 17, and then after a moment, he used his key and came in. He said I had humiliated Sloan. I said Sloan had spoken on camera in front of staff and a contracted planning team. He said I had engineered the whole thing. I said I had arranged to be present as what I was. I said I had not put any words in anyone's mouth. He paced to the window and back. He said vendors were calling. He said Dana Pryor had submitted a formal complaint to the Planning Association about conditions on the job.